question suggests, okay, we are facing as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, not the onset of a crisis, but a crisis that is becoming deeper and deeper. We all know that 3 decades of India's attempt at integration with the world economy and seeking to grow and develop through that may have had success, if you look at it in relative terms, on the growth side. But if one looks at the development side, or the wider notion of development, it's been 3 decades in which the movement has been relatively limited. That disconnect between the growth and the development process has in this decade shown up in the form of that growth process and that accumulation process itself running into difficulties or problems. And the COVID-19 crisis can be said to be, in that sense, the last nail in the coffin. That either India is now placed in a position that either we find a way of restructuring our economy internally and our international relations in such a way that the Indian economy and society is able to regenerate itself, or we are going to see an accelerated process of what I may call decay of Indian society. It's not, of course, there are economic underlying factors behind this, but I think it's a larger process of a larger social crisis and a process of decay that we are seeing, and many of the political problems that we see today are, in a sense, reflections of that. So let me begin by just briefly showing that one of the implications of the fragile state of the Indian economy is the scale of the impact that the COVID-19 crisis or pandemic has had on the economy. So the extent of contraction, of course, aided by the process of the lockdown. So in India, the infection, the epidemic kind of set in somewhat late. The major restrictions started getting imposed around the middle of March, and we had the lockdown from the 25th of March. So it's from March that really the first effects on the economy started getting felt. And in the period from March till May, for which we have data, here are some data for 3 months. And for the entire year 2019-20 is also given to provide a kind of comparison. You can see that the contractionary effect of the pandemic has been massive in India. And while there's some moderation of that in May, it is still pretty significant contraction that has happened. We have some other data which is only up to April, which is for the industrial sector particularly, which also shows the massive contractionary effect that has happened on the economy, and also the revenue position of the government also reflects this severe contraction that has taken place. We have some data which is only available significantly up to March, but we know from these things that, let's say, passenger vehicle sales or airline passenger traffic growth was 0 in April and very limited even in May. And we have private sources of data also showing the very significant contractionary effect that has happened. This Purchasing Managers Index reflects a contraction if it has a value below 50. You can see how significant was the fall in April and May, and even the March figures were not particularly good. So, and CMI data also tells us that the unemployment rate in India jumped up dramatically in April and stayed at around that level in May too, and perhaps maybe slowly coming down now, but I'm not sure how far it reflects an actual improvement in the employment situation, or just simply a way in which people are trying to survive after having been out of work for so long. So finding ways of somehow creating their own employment rather than the normal resumption of economic activity. So I think if to put this in perspective, this is a very massive kind of contraction of the economy that has been seen, perhaps a contraction that when the final data comes, may be one of the largest in the world that one have seen in the world as a result of this COVID-19 pandemic. Okay. And this massive contraction has come without even the attendant benefit of India managing to suppress the epidemic in the area. So the cases are still growing. We are still on an upward trajectory as far as the coronavirus epidemic is concerned. So this process of this health medical crisis producing contractionary effects on the economy, partly on account of the way people respond to it, and partly on account of the containment measures that have to be taken against them. This is a process that is likely to keep on continuing, and we are not necessarily going necessarily smoothly in the direction of normalcy either. We've seen, for example, Chennai going back into lockdown because of the rise in cases there. So we have had a massive contractionary effect, which is without the benefit of having at least helped us in controlling the epidemic. So we are not in a position to even restore the economy to its normal condition because of the fact that we have managed to pass the height of the epidemic. Now, this particular massive contraction comes in the background of a steady process of decline in India's growth rate, GDP growth rate, which was the topic of discussion before anyone had heard about the novel coronavirus, where everyone was talking about the Indian economy slowing down significantly. And for 8 successive quarters, we had seen this particular process of decline. The latest data has come for the first quarter of this calendar year, the last quarter of the financial year, which is January to March. Of course, we tend to attribute this to the coronavirus, but of course, the effect of the coronavirus comes only in the last month of this 3-month period. So it's not all got to do with the coronavirus. It was part of a trend that was already there. If one looks at it in a slightly longer time frame, one sees that the growth rate of India's GDP has been steadily coming down every year since the year that demonetization happened. So demonetization and introduction of GST are 2 shocks which data would suggest also had an effect of slowing down Indian GDP growth. And the slowdown that we were seeing before was a kind of culmination of that process, and the COVID-19 crisis has come on top of that particular phenomenon. But I would suggest that this particular growth process itself, this slowing down that we are seeing, is reflecting a longer-term, deeper problem, which has been seen for at least a decade, if not longer, since the since the global crisis of 2008. Okay. The growth rate itself is, of course, a matter of controversy in India, and even those who've been official dumb, like Arvind Subramaniam, have argued that the growth rate in India on an average was about 4.5% per annum up to 2016-17, rather than the 7% per annum which the official new GDP series introduced in 2015 estimated. Okay, if you take that into account, or if you say that okay, that is a correct picture, then that would mean that Indian growth had slowed down before demonetization and GST impact was felt. Okay, and certainly, of course, before COVID-19 effect was felt. It had already slowed down considerably, and from that level, then there has been a slowing down taking place, which means that we were perhaps already in a recession or a near recessionary situation before the COVID-19 impact came. Now, leaving aside the controversies about the GDP series, there are other indications which are clearly showing that the Indian growth process in this particular decade, which is ending now, was already floundering. So in terms of the industrial growth, this has been India's second decade of industrial stagnation after the first one which started in the mid-1960s. So from 1980, this has been the worst phase of industrial growth that we've seen right through the decade. And while this is an average being shown here, if you look at year-by-year figures, it is persistently the volume of industrial production has been extremely growing extremely slowly. Year by year, you get the same picture. So this average is truly an average. It is not average where the variance or deviation is standard deviation is very high. Okay. And you are seeing a steady process of what has been called premature deindustrialization, where the share of manufacturing in India's GDP has been shrinking and persistently shrinking. Even the new GDP series shows a slight increase in the level of the manufacturing shares in GDP because of the change in method, but the trend of decline is very clear. And please note that India's manufacturing sector share GDP peaked around the mid-1990s. That share itself was not very much different from the share in 1975. So essentially, it's been decades since we have seen a process of increasing share of manufacturing in India's GDP on a consistent basis. And this, we are now in a period which is already longer than a decade in which there's a steady decline of manufacturing's relative importance within the economy. The other important sector where you see a major change taking place is in the case of construction, which is extremely important because construction was the main sector which absorbed the people who were moving out of agriculture as the agrarian crisis started deepening from the mid-1990s. It was the same time at which you had also the onset of a construction boom, which lasted till the end of the previous decade. And construction became the main sector of absorbing people who were moving out of agriculture. But that sector also has, which boomed till the end of the previous decade, has slowed down considerably, as you can see, by the movement of the red curve compared to the two other measures of what was happening in the previous decade. So in the same period in which construction GDP more than doubled in the previous decade, it hasn't even increased by 35% in the present decade. So the industrial sector's performance has been exceptionally poor in this particular decade. We've also seen a dramatic turnaround in the trend that was observed in the previous decade of a very fast rise in India's investment ratio, where for the first time in India's history, people started talking about an investment-led process of growth in India. So the high growth phase before the global crisis was one in which you had this dramatic rise in the investment ratio. But since then, it has been in a steady process of decline. And in this decade also, it's been declining. Now, this reflects not just a declining investment ratio, it actually reflects an almost complete stagnation in investment, which is partly reflecting the slowdown in the growth of construction activities, but also reflecting the stagnation in expenditure on machinery and equipment, which is reflected in the fact that both the production and imports of capital goods in India have been stagnating for more than a decade, in sharp contrast to the very rapid growth in both seen in the previous decade when the investment ratio actually went up. The same story is there with regard to India's trade in both goods and services, that the importance of trade, both exports and imports, in the previous decade, particularly in the period before the global crisis, was very dramatic in India. So all the indicators of India's increased integration moved up during that period. But in this decade, particularly, it has been in a downward trajectory, consistently in downward trajectory. Even a little bit of an upward trend then has got reversed before the COVID-19 impact actually was felt. And this gives you an indication of the huge difference. That if you look at the dollar values of Indian exports, imports, India's invisibles, where we've always had a surplus, and foreign investment, they've almost been stagnant throughout this decade, up and down a little bit, but essentially around the same level as in 2011. Well, in marked contrast to very rapid increase in the previous decade. So integration with the world economy is not seeming to produce in this decade any significant growth impulses in the Indian economy. Now, this should should put into perspective the so-called taming of Indian inflation in the second half of this decade and the so-called improvement in India's current account position. These have happened on the basis of the fact that essentially your economy is reflecting significant demand constraints, and the sectors which are experiencing this the most are producing these sluggish tendencies in your international interaction, and the demand constraints in turn are leading to the inflationary pressures easing. So even as India has attempted to take advantage of that by trying to ease monetary policy and to push credit, it has not seemed to have had any effect. And throughout this decade, the growth of bank credit in India has been extremely slow, again in very sharp contrast to what we saw in the previous decade. Okay. So throughout this decade, what has India been doing? India has been supposedly undertaking more and more reforms whose primary objective is to unleash the animal spirits, to create a growth and development process which is driven by private investment, both domestic and foreign, which is based on pushing up India's exports, which is supposed to strengthen India's employment, manufacturing sector, okay, which is supposed to expand in the housing sector in India. All of these so-called objectives of the reforms that India has been pursuing throughout this decade, which is a continuation of the reforms that were started in 1991. Every objective that the Indian reform process was seeking to achieve seemed to have been conspicuous by their absence. It simply not happened throughout this decade. Instead, what we have got is a growth process which has increasingly got concentrated in services, which in the Indian case is not generating significant increments in employment, and a growth process which has become increasingly dependent on consumption growth of a certain section of the population for sustaining itself, okay, on the demand side. Okay. And this has happened despite the fiscal behavior of the Indian state during this period being, as one might say, India has been very well behaved in that sense, and spent the whole decade trying to undo the effects of the post-global crisis fiscal stimulus by trying to reduce the fiscal deficit. And the effort has been mainly achieved through the constraining of expenditure growth, public expenditure growth. And now that is also coming undone because the revenue side because of the underlying economic realities, the revenue situation, which never improved throughout this decade, is now becoming worse. And the COVID-19 crisis, of course, will make it increase that crisis dramatically. So you see this sharp rise in the fiscal deficit, which is what the government of India seems to be so worried about what to do. And therefore, one of the sources of its reluctance to spend during this crisis reflects this particular process. So India has been very well behaved on the fiscal side, largely. India has pursued reforms, improving the business confidence, Make in India, Skill India. So many reforms have been attempted, primarily with the objective of generating international economic interaction and private investment-led process of growth and development. But a decade has passed, and we have simply not seen it happen. Now, the reason why this has not happened is that the elephant in the room has not been really addressed. And that is this, that you have had a process where significant sections of the Indian population have seen a stagnation in income, and that stagnation has underlined a process of increasing inequality, where growth in income, if it takes place, tends to be concentrated in the hands of those who hold assets mainly, while those who labor have seen a stagnation in their income, and they constitute 90% of the Indian population. And this attempt at growing, therefore, through what can be called the cheap labor economy, where labor services are available in all activities, from personal services to the most highly productive activities at extremely low cost to the buyers of the labor services, that cheap labor economy, perhaps the growth and accumulation process based on that cheap labor economy is coming to an end. This, you can see here that this is indicating. So the first three rows tell you what is the earnings of most people who work in this country, and the figures in the brackets tell you their share in the workforce. How low are the earnings of most people who labor? And they, of course, make up 90% of the Indian population. And you can see here in the factory workers case, you can see a clear indication that even organized sector where you have unions and all, the earnings are exceptionally low. So they have remained low and stagnant for a long period of time. So all the benefits of that growth have been concentrated in the top 10% of the population. And you've seen this massive increase in inequality that has happened. So a growth process based on that was already reaching its limits for a combination of reasons which mutually reinforce each other. One side is, of course, the demand constraint. That if you have a growth process in which 90% of the population is excluded from the market, you are not able to find success on the export side, then you are facing a problem that, okay, you are dependent on investment, but the 10% population which sees an increase in income, it doesn't generate the kind of demand which would allow for large investments to take place, and therefore investments also require. Yeah, I'm concluding. So the implication of this is that you have a demand problem. Second is that the cheap labor economy puts limits to your learning in terms of and the skill development of the workforce, its productivity, and the easy option of cheap labor also impedes the development of the efficient methods of production, learning by enterprises to produce more efficiently rather than relying on cheap labor to extract maximum profits. And the limits of this have been reached, and the thinning of your industrial sector and your development of industrial capacities are also being reached. And therefore, it is not a short-term macroeconomic problem that can simply be addressed by simply stepping up expenditure. But stepping up expenditure and the willingness to use at least fiscal policy to address this problem of rising inequalities in India and the rising and the serious problem of employment in India remains, I think, the key to addressing this particular problem. But unfortunately, what we are seeing is that it is the reliance on cheap labor itself which is seen to be the solution. So governments don't spend, private enterprises should profit from cheap labor. That's the way to solve the problem. That's the approach that is being followed even today. So government doesn't spend, and government wants to amend labor laws so as to make it easier to take advantage of cheap labor. But cheap labor has paid whatever dividends it could have paid already, and we have spent a decade seeing that it's no longer enough to even keep growth and accumulation growing for the top 10% of the Indian population, and therefore the crisis is only going to become deeper as we go ahead. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Can the last is Professor Vikas?
Yeah. Just give me a second. Since we've already overshot the time that was allotted to this session, I'll try and be brief and maybe try and limit myself to 10 minutes. In some sense, I'm extending what Professor Ghosh talked about in the morning, and Professor Mazumdar has just talked about the whole sort of slowdown that one sees